Fingers crossed.
Okay, I see the red dot. It looks like
Okay,
it's recording.
ready to go. Okay,
Great.
welcome SciCommers to June Mentor Chat. I'm really excited today to introduce Nicholas St. Fleur, who is a freelance science journalist in the Bay Area. And before he went freelance, he was a New York Times science reporter for a few years. He wrote for The Atlantic before that. He was an NPR intern before that. He just wrote a children's book, and
I
of all
did.
of that experience, which I'm sad he's not going to talk in detail about the children's book, but he's going to talk to us today about interviewing techniques and a little bit about how he got to where he is today. So thank you so much for being here, and take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that gracious introduction. I really appreciate it. And if anyone does want to hear about my children's book, I'm actually very proud of it. So we can certainly have some questions about that. But yes, as mentioned, I'm going to focus my talk on interviewing sources, just kind of how I interview different sources, how I find diverse experts as well to make sure that I interview. I did put together a little bit of a PowerPoint, so I'm going to give you a few minutes of a background about like who I am, what I cover and such, and then we'll kind of jump into some of the discussion and some of the discussion about how I find sources and how I interview. So let me share my screen. You guys make sure, do let me know if everything is working. Okay, I'm pressing the share and great. Can you guys see that presentation all right? Yes, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Perfect, great, great. So yes, this is some info about me. As was mentioned, I am right now a freelance science reporter. I'm mostly a contributor for the New York Times. So I am based in the San Francisco Bay Area. I live here with my partner who works over at Stanford. She used to be a PhD student over there. I've been writing for the New York Times for about 5 years now. I wrote for the Atlantic for a while. I did a whole bunch of internships from Scientific American to NPR, where I first met Joe, to Science Magazine, to San Jose Mercury News. So I have interviewed scientists for a variety of publications. Background-wise, I got my degree, my undergraduate degree, I studied biology at Cornell University. And then I got my graduate degree at UC Santa Cruz. They have a program in science communication, which some of you may have heard of, you might actually be interested in. It's a program that typically takes PhDs and people who have a science background and teaches them how to be journalists. When I was there, it was just a graduate certification program, but now it's a master's program. Unfortunately, they don't retroactively give me a master's degree, but I would certainly like one. So if anyone has questions about that program as well, feel free to reach out to me. And up here, you'll see my email address and my Twitter account. Feel free to tweet at me as well. My DMs are always open, so if you have any good story ideas or anything, or if you have any questions, do feel free to reach out. So a little bit about me. My editor at the Times lovingly calls me our dead world correspondent, which I think is pretty cool. I cover a lot of archaeology, paleontology, astronomy. The joke I like to make is I cover things that, you know, died a while ago, died a really long time ago, and, you know, may have never been alive or may have been alive. We don't know when it comes to astronomy. So, it's led me to cover a number of, you know, graveyards, this one being an ancient Philistine graveyard. I've covered shipwrecks, this particular one in the Mediterranean. This particular story was about Kakucha, who may have been the earliest known boomerang victim. What was interesting about this story was I was speaking with a member of the Aboriginal community who found this this skeleton while he was walking across a lake. I believe his name is Badger. That is the name he goes by. And he was telling us that, you know, the moment he saw this skeleton, he could kind of see its pain, but the moment he saw him, he knew that was his, you know, his ancestor. So one of the things I'll get into with this story is what I like to do with my journalism is when I talk to sources, I make sure I get the story out of them. The paper, the actual scientific publication, that PDF we download, it only tells you so much. It tells you kind of what was found, a little bit about why it's important, and it attempts to put it into context. But what science journalists do, what I believe science journalists should do is, get the story behind every one of those papers. There are people who are, in the lab doing science. There are cases like this one where, you have members of the community where the science is being done who are a part of the work. So I made sure to speak with Badger for this particular case. And this was in Australia, so I had to be up super, super early for that one, I remember. But one thing I'll touch upon in our talk is I try my best if there's ever someone who is, since I do a lot of archaeology reporting, I'm often dealing with remains from whether it be indigenous groups, indigenous peoples, or sites in countries where, in all honesty, the local people often aren't quoted or are often overlooked in media reports. So I try my hardest to make sure that I'm hearing from them, which was the case in this particular story. And as you can see here, the idea behind this story was that they found a gash on his face. And if you look at that, you might think that at first, the scientists thought this guy was the victim of frontier violence when the Europeans came into Australia. But through radiocarbon dating of where he was buried and the material near his grave, they were able to find that his death predated European colonization. So the scientists had to do had to do a bit of research to find out what kind of weapon could have left a scar like this. And they determined it was most likely a boomerang. So one thing to kind of quickly touch upon, since I do report on archaeology, I am, I guess you can say, cognizant of the fact that many of my articles do show human remains. So what I do try to do is have a bit of a conversation when I'm talking to scientists or when I'm talking to indigenous people, a bit about the ethics of showing the remains, whether or not they got any kind of like green light to be able to have these images in their research. But it is something that we have a lot of conversation about. What is the proper way to show, human remains to the public and such. So if you have kind of questions on that, or if there's any kind of dialogue you have with that, I'd be more than happy to listen and hear a bit more about. But that's something I'm always interested in learning more about. So in this particular case, this was the site of a massacre, a Swedish fort. And going back to this, one thing I remember from this particular story is what the researchers found was this was a bit of a sneak attack. They found, I think it was a dozen, probably more than a dozen skeletons just scattered around this fort. And what was interesting is that all of the signs made it look as if this was a sneak attack because all of the people had these defensive marks on them. They looked like they were taken by surprise. There were cases where one person was, his body was knocked over onto a fire afterwards, and they had taken like teeth from a goat, I believe, and they shoved it in his mouth. You'll have to forgive me if I'm a little blurry on these details. Some of these I published a little while ago, but I'm remembering some of the interesting things here. And what I loved about this particular story is I was able to get a Game of Thrones kind of quote out of the researcher back before the last season of Game of Thrones came out and everyone hated Game of Thrones. So this was back when this was like a fun show to watch. So one thing I also love to do in my reporting is if I can get something that relates an event to something that my readers can relate to, I definitely reach for that. So as soon as they said it was similar to Game of Thrones, I made sure to either I quoted them or I made sure to use that in the language of my story. I've also written about mummies. In this particular case, this was a museum who had a mummy that was found about 100 years ago, but dated to about 4,000 years. And with the help of the FBI, they were able to discover the identity of this mummy. The story being that they had an idea it was either a governor or the governor's wife, being the governor, his name is Jehudi Nacht. But because of some of the, I guess you can say, because of just how old the actual face is, they weren't sure if it was the man or the woman. So what they did was they extracted a tooth from the mummy's head, going through the neck, and they were able to, get that tooth, and then they were able to drill into it, extract some DNA, and then after some time, the FBI researchers were able to determine that it was a boy, that it was Jehudi Nott, the governor himself. Prior attempts were unfruitful. In one case they did a CT scan and they found that some of the facial bones were missing because of some ceremony having to do with the mummification process. So any other clues as to whether or not it was a woman or a man were kind of gone. So this was the one kind of way that they were able to determine who it was. And when I'm doing a story like this, what I love about it is this is telling a detective story. So I made sure to talk to almost everyone who was a part of the process at one point. I believe they worked with scientists at, I think it was at Harvard Med, I want to say, or Boston, somewhere in Boston, I want to say, because this was at the MFA. And I just talked to these medical doctors. They were telling me that when they had to do the CT scan, they had to enter in the pharaoh's information into the system in order to do the scan, and they actually kind of broke the system because when they put the date, they had to say it was 4,000 years old, and the machine didn't actually register to a subject being that old. So the reason I, of course, bring all of this up is that in my reporting, I make sure I'm telling the story behind it. The paper itself just talked about hey, we found out the kind of identity of this mummy. Hey, we were able to extract DNA from it. But the real story is that this took several years. Different teams had tried, and it wasn't until this team at the FBI was finally able to do it. And I also went into a bit of the backstory about who Jehudi Nott was, how they discovered his tomb. The archaeologists who found his tomb, they actually went inside and they noticed that the whole place there was a big mess all over the place. There was, once they finally got to the actual tomb, what they saw was just the head of Jehudi Nott right there, like a pedestal on the actual tomb itself. The idea is that they think that the tomb robbers came in and ripped off the head to get at the jewels. So another thing I love to cover is dinosaurs. This particular one was an early relative of T-Rex. And then I've written about a recent dinosaur. This guy was known as the Reaper of Death, found over there in Canada. So one of the cool things is, I love dinosaurs. Dinosaurs are one of my, favorite areas of science. So anytime I get to write a dino story, it's a good day. I have written about fossilized amber as well. And what's always interesting about amber is not just reporting on the actual find itself. In this case, the big one looks like it was believed to have been a dinosaur tail. There's still some debate over that, but at the time they believed it was a dinosaur tail. And the other two, one is a bird talon, and the other one is, I like to call this one like it was in the nightmares of dinosaurs, because it's like a spider mixed in with a bit of a scorpion. But when you're telling a story about amber, you have to include a bit about how it was found. In this particular case, there's this scientist who goes to the amber markets of Myanmar to kind of find these particular pieces. But in recent years, amber stories have really gotten a lot of I guess you can say pushback in terms of whether or not we should be covering amber finds, because there's a lot of just dark and bad things happening in these amber mines. I'm talking on the scale of genocides and such. So discussions that my editor and I have had, and that my editor and other science reporters have had, is whether or not we will cover amber stories in the future. But I show it here to say that when I'm asking people, I asked this scientist kind of how you got it. He said he was in this amber market and he spotted what looked like, at first I think they thought it was leaves, but at first he looked at it and he was like, no, I knew it was a dinosaur tail. I also get to cover the space, the cosmos. The way I like to put it is, at the Times, we have an excellent reporter in Ken Chang, who, for the most part, covers everything within the solar system. Dennis Overby covers everything outside of the solar system, so your black holes and such. And then for a while, when I was on staff there, I like to say the cosmic crumbs that would fall in between. Um, But one of those crumbs was absolutely spectacular, being the total solar eclipse of 2017. Now I'm going to do a quick look through. Did any of you guys, give me a thumbs up, any of you guys got to see the eclipse in 2017? Yeah, I'm seeing a couple head nods. Perfect. Great. Great. I mean, that was a pretty life-altering experience for me. It was just so otherworldly. I got to write a story about eclipse chasers. So when I'm doing this particular story, I started off by speaking with one person who's an expert on, eclipses, had seen 60 or so. I mean, had seen probably 30 or so in his case. And I thought that was a lot until he told me there was a whole community out there of eclipse chasers. There's a guy named Jay Pasakoff, who's, I believe, holds a record somewhere in the low 60s. There's this guy, Hakeem. Hakeem, I actually discovered when I was, doing a bit of research into eclipse chasers, and I found a documentary called Black Suns about a black eclipse chasers. And I was just like blown away. I was like, wow, this is fantastic. They're a group of solar physicists and astrophysicists and astronomers who, chase the moon's shadow across the world. So I spoke with Hakeem as well, and just learned a bit about, why he was so passionate about the eclipse. And oftentimes when you're speaking with people, you just learn so much more about them than just like their one particular passion. You hear about their whole life story, and sometimes that sticks in the back of your head for future stories as well. I wrote about, a plane that was following the eclipse and kind of trying to get as many minutes of totality as it could. So all of these come from research I got from just speaking to one source. And I said, so what else is cool is happening with the eclipse? And they said, some people are tracking it by sky, some people are tracking it, some people are going to be tracking it from the ground. So in this particular case, I was in Carbondale, Illinois, and I was on a football stadium with about 14,000 people. But unlike a normal game, no one was looking at the ground, no one was looking at the field. We were all looking up to the sky. And I got to do a nice quirky story about, the town and how this small college town was preparing to get inundated, just absolutely flooded by eclipse eclipse groupies, as one of the gentlemen put it. And all of this came from speaking to one person, and they said, one thing I always ask after an interview is, who else should I be speaking to? So they pointed me to everyone else in the town, the small town, who had caught, eclipse mania. So over here's one of the students, a young woman named Jasmine, who was part of a project. I believe it was Citizen Kate, where they set up telescopes across the line of totality, across the country, from coast to coast, to try to take movies of the eclipse. And as you can see over here, this was the actual scene from the stadium, and it was just so exciting. So if there's anything you take from my talk here, I just love to say, anyone who will listen to me, 2024 is the year. It's coming back. 2017, it was a hit. 2024, it's going to be more on the East Coast. Make sure you get a spot. So right now I wanted to take a quick talk about like my interviewing of sources. So I'm going to stop the screen share. I'll come back to the rest of my PowerPoint, but I wanted this to be a little bit of a conversation. If you guys have some questions about interviewing sources, and then we'll get back to my PowerPoint, or if Burley or Joe have anything to chime in with. So the way I approach interviewing sources, I tend to do it in such a way that my interviews tend to be conversations. At various news outlets where I've worked at, I always get a little bit of slack because people say, you're always having so much fun with your sources. You're a talker, Nick, and that's definitely true. But I find being a talker gets me a lot further in my interviews. So I know often people have like a list of questions that they have set up that they want to basically cover. I tend to, at this point, I know the main questions that I ask. So I wouldn't say so much that I have a list of questions as much as I have ideas of where I want to take this story. So the way I approach my reporting is I start off by, reading the paper first, reading the press release. I try my hardest not to, you know, spend too much time looking at the actual press release. I don't know how many of you guys are actually journalists or have ever written. One of the problems I find with just reading a press release too much is that you start thinking of ideas, and once you get to the writing process, you're like, oh, this is a great line, this is a great line. And then you look back to the press release and you're like, wait a second, that's why that particular phrase stuck in my head or something. So I try to not like really bias my own writing by reading the press release too much. What I tend to do with press releases is I'll use it, I'll send it to my editor, he'll take a look, he'll say, okay, this looks like a good story to go on. And then I'll use the press release to kind of fact check after my story's done to kind of make sure I got whatever, or to make sure I'm not missing any main points that the other researchers thought was important. So when I'm interviewing a source, so to back it up, as soon as I get the green light from my editor, what I tend to do is I immediately start actually finding outside sources. So typically my stories are on deadline. I'll have a couple days to report them out. Some of you may or may not be familiar with the embargo system. The way it works is us journalists, we tend to get a paper a few days in advance. The idea is that it gives us time to properly vet the paper, speak with the authors, as well as speak with some outside experts to make sure that the work is valid. Or if there's some criticism of the work, to give the researchers some time to respond to that criticism. So what I like to do is I like to find outside researchers first, and it's actually kind of funny. It can take me a while. It's something that I feel like I need to probably, I can get so absorbed, and I can find like as many people as possible. I normally have a whiteboard, or I'll have a separate Google Doc where I just, so I'll dive into the paper itself. I'll go into the sources cited section, and I'll look to see, I look at it from two ways. I look at it from who has been cited, who has done a paper like most recently. So that way I know they're still in the field, they're still doing work. So I'll look at those names, and then I'll say, who do they cite the most often? So I'll look at those citations, I'll put them on my computer, and then I'll look up these researchers. Now, one thing I strongly believe is that as a journalist, we should do the best that we can to make sure that our sources, reflect the wider audience of who, is not just doing the science, but who's also reading, who's interested, who the science impacts. So what I do is after I get these names and everything, I'll do further research. I'll look at their their website, their research website. I'll look who's in their lab, who are some of the postdocs or other senior scientists who are involved. I'm always looking for like women who are involved, or scientists, researchers of color. And I make sure to, one thing I try my hardest to do is to have a bit of a 50-50 ratio of women and men in my stories. So one way you can really make sure you're holding yourself accountable for that is go the extra step, and just make sure you leave no rock like unturned when you're finding outside sources. Sometimes it's very easy to find people who have often been, repeatedly quoted in the media. Oftentimes these are senior scientists, and oftentimes you'll find that women don't get cited as often in the media. So it's up to you to, make sure that you are keeping that in mind, and make sure that you are, finding women and people of color who are sources in these particular areas. And they're out there, and there's so many resources to find them as well. So in this day and age, I kind of feel if you aren't able to find someone, that's like a bit of malpractice on your part as a journalist, because sometimes it might take extra time, but that's just you doing your own work to kind of fight some of the biases that are just inherent in the science world. And I mean, if there's anything we've been seeing from Twitter in the past couple of weeks, is that it's an effort. It's going to take some time to really diversify your sources, and to diversify the science media. So yeah, I do that. I also do searches for whatever topic I'm looking at. I also look at like what outlets are out there, what has been previously published on this work, and I just have a whole running list. And honestly, I cast a wide net. Sometimes I'll quote like 2 or 3 outside sources, but I may have reached out to 6 or 7. Um, what I tend to do is for outside sources, I send emails. I have, I would say, 3 general questions that I ask that I'm curious about. So I send a pretty good email about like a general email about, hey, I'm Nicholas St. Fleur. I'm writing this story for the New York Times. I came across your work. I believe whenever we write about a new paper, we reach out to outside experts to get their opinion. I came across your work. You seem to be someone who could comment on this. Would you mind reading over this paper and answering a couple questions? The reason I send emails for outside sources is I'm on deadline. I find it works faster, especially if I'm reaching out to like 6 or 7. I generally send my first question is generally, what are your overall thoughts on this paper? Second one is something that's more unique to their, more specific to their expertise. Like if they're an expert on radiocarbon dating, I'll say, does the dating look right? If they're an expert in a particular, field of archaeology, I'll ask them for more of their archaeological perspective. Um, I just saw a quick question. Are you allowed to share an embargoed paper with an outside expert? Yes, yes, you are. This is how we get comments on papers beforehand. I normally tell them in the email that I do not want you sharing this with anyone. I know there are some journalists who go back and forth about whether or not you even send the paper to someone who is, before you get that verification. I do just send out the paper with my initial email because I'm on a deadline, and it makes more sense for me instead of waiting for them to come back. Um, Oftentimes I'm dealing with people all over the world, so they might get back to me while I'm asleep and say, yeah, I totally want to be a source for this. And then I have to wake up and say, okay, here's the paper, and then they get back to me. So I find it a lot easier to just send the paper. I send the paper, I send the press release, I send any additional information as well that might help them out. And I just send it to them. And I always say at the bottom, I say, what areas of this paper do you find are what are some limitations of the paper, and what areas, what would you have liked to have seen on the paper? So whenever I send these emails, they come with those 3 basic questions, which is, what are your general views on this paper? Number 2 is a more specific question to that particular researcher. And then number 3 is, what would you have liked to have seen? What are some of the limitations?
Nicholas, I have a quick
Go
question
right ahead.
since you brought up kind of this idea of sending questions in an email. So can you talk a little bit about getting quotes from sources by email versus on the phone, if that's
Right.
different, and how you kind of tease that out, as well as the idea of sending questions ahead of time?
Right. So I'll jump on the first one. I mean, on the last part of your question first, asking questions ahead of time. I do that depending on circumstance. Most times I send an email to a researcher and I just say, hey, I came across your work. Can we chat? And then we just have our interview. Um, I will send questions beforehand if the person is either uh, expresses to me that, hey, I'm not a native English speaker. It would be very beneficial if you send it to me beforehand. Um, I send questions beforehand if sometimes they're skeptical. So they'll say to me, hey, if they ask me like, what would you be asking about? I just send a very general like set of questions. Generally what I'm looking for is like, what was going through your mind when you found XYZ, when you found this dinosaur bone, or when you found this mummy. So I do that at times, but most times not so much. When it comes to getting quotes from sources, I find emails, it depends, right? So with emails, oftentimes what I like about them is I make sure to say to my editor, to the people who I'm quoting, that, hey, I'm just looking for something that's short and snippy. If you look at my past articles, you'll see at the bottom of nearly every one of my articles will have a, as one researcher lovingly said, it's kind of like a cameo from another researcher, just coming in, kind of giving their 2 cents and then getting out of the story. So typically I quote only like a sentence from what they're emailing me. but in every one of my emails to an outside source, I also say, hey, if you want to talk in person, I'd love to talk in person. And what I like about talking in person is I'm the kind of person who, I feel at least, I can get more fun quotes out of people, by talking to them, by having that conversation. But what I like about getting outside sources via email is that sometimes you just get it nice and snap and it's exactly what you need. And a lot of researchers are very good at giving their thoughts concisely, and a lot of people actually feel way more comfortable in that sense. So when it comes to outside researchers, I'm fine with emails. Of course, always check with your editor, but on deadline it makes the most sense. I'm seeing a couple uh, questions.
Yeah, I think that the highest one
Does
up would
anyone?
be pretty straightforward. How responsive are researchers in general?
Yeah, so this depends on outlet, and I gotta say I have had the privilege of working for a lot of bigger names, so they're super responsive. From the Times, they're I get email back. Sometimes I get an email back by the time I'm sending all my other emails. So typically, what I do is I'll write out all my emails. So I have to researcher A, researcher B, outside source A, outside source B, and then I just press send, 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 send all at the same time. And sometimes if I have a lot or whatever, by the time I press send on the last one, the first one has already said, yeah, let's chat. So that happens. But I remember when I was working for local papers, it can take some time, I guess. I would say, but scientists tend to be pretty responsible, I would say. Not everyone is lucky enough to have the New York Times or NPR or the Atlantic. I would just say be persistent. Send an email. If you're on deadline, send another one in a couple hours. When I'm on deadline, nearly regardless on where I am in the reporting process, I start out my email with in all caps, on deadline, and then I say what the subject is. So I say on deadline, the New York Times interview request, or I say on deadline, the New York Times request for comment. I'm seeing a couple more questions, whichever one you want.
Yeah, I think Joe must have posted this. A lot of scientists don't understand how embargoes work or why they exist. I'm not sure if, Joe, you mean we should do a little explanation here, or just in general what you need to explain to scientists when you're emailing them that you're on deadline.
Well, I think Nick brought it up. I mean, sometimes scientists will say, "Oh, I can't talk to you. This paper's on embargo," and the answer is, yes, it's on embargo, so I can talk to you because
Mm-hmm.
the
I
embargo
see.
system was
Exactly.
I
established.
see. Hmm.
Journalists, well, the 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 laudatory reason for it is to give journalists a chance to, do a responsible story and talk to various people about the paper. The
Right.
not so laudatory reason is so that everybody in the news media will write the story on the same day and it gets more attention that way.
That's
Yeah.
very true as well. And I
Mm-hmm.
know there are a lot of journalists who kind of have, excuse me, a love-hate relationship with the embargo system. So I'll take one more brief question and then I'll kind of jump back into my slides just because there are a couple of things I wanted to address. But
Yeah. Do you feel bad when you can't quote somebody that you've spoken with? And
I
you
I
do if
do.
you're on deadline and they're not responding.
I
I,
do. And what I've done to at least make myself not feel as bad is for the past probably year and a half, I just have been very transparent in my initial email, which says, hey, I'm reaching out to multiple sources, outside sources, not just you. So I may quote you, I may not quote you. And I'm just being transparent with that. What I hate the most, honestly, is I quote someone and then my editor takes it out and it's like a really good quote. That's a different thing that I hate. But yeah, I would say I definitely do. It depends, right? I mean, if I'm speaking to someone and they're just going on and they're not really adding anything, then I won't quote them. If I'm speaking to someone, one researcher, and they say the exact same thing as another researcher, I'm speaking in terms of main like researchers, then I'll choose to quote whoever said it more, eloquently. It depends, but at this point in the stage, no. And I've been fortunate enough that I haven't gotten any emails of someone saying "Hey, we spoke for an hour. You didn't quote me. You wasted my time. Blah blah blah." So I don't know if that's just the privilege of working for the Times that people don't want to, burn a bridge, but luckily I've been lucky in that sense. So I'm going to just go back to my PowerPoint real quickly, just so that I can kind of share a couple of examples from my own writing. Share screen, share, and then do this. Okay. So these are just some examples. I decided to look at some of my recent stories and pull out a couple quotes and kind of discuss to you why I chose this quote, kind of what questions I asked to get it. So bear with me as I kind of read these out. But over here it says, in 2008, Sandra and John DeGroot were walking in southern Alberta along the shore where Oldman River meets the Bow River. They spotted something in the ice. We looked down and I kind of said jokingly, "Hey, it looks like a dinosaur jaw," Mr. DeGroot said. As he bent over to grab it, his heart started pounding. We looked a little closer and it certainly was. So I love stories where the main finding is done by someone who's not a scientist. I am a huge advocate for citizen science. Sorry, the fire truck just went by. I'm a huge advocate and a huge fan of citizen science. I love the idea that science can be done by anyone, and scientists look like everyone. So in this particular case, this couple, they were just walking, down by the river, and they saw what they thought was a dinosaur bone. I love these moments of where the finding happens. I love recreating it. I spend most of my interviews asking for this question, like, where were you when you found this? What was it like? What was the ground like? What was the atmosphere like? I love to say, if I were to pick up my reader and place them down there with you, what is it that they saw? Like, what did you find? Here's another case. Colorado fossils show how mammals raced to fill dinosaurs' void. I found this ugly white-looking rock that looked like it had a little mammal jaw coming out of it, Dr. Lyson said. He cracked it open and found inside part of a fossilized crocodile. That was the moment when the light bulb went off. If there's one concretion with fossils inside, there's got to be more. So we defined what a concretion was before this, I believe. But the idea here is he found this rock. He looked at it. He said to himself, I bet there's a fossil inside. He cracked it open and boom, there it was. And as he explained, I try my best to, show as opposed to like telling. And he shows it with his quote, the light bulb went off right there. And we always like to say, what was that aha moment? I mean, he literally told me the aha moment. And once he realized all the little rocks around him that at first he just kind of glanced over were actually containing inside of them fossils. Okay, so they were all these little like treasure chests right there in plain sight that he didn't realize until and we went into a little backstory about this, but he had been on a different fossil find where one of the scientists had done this in South Africa and showed him, hey, this is how we find fossils here. And he's looking around, he's finding no fossils until it occurs to him, hey, why don't I look at these little white rocks? Why don't I look at it? He found this particular one, saw the drawing, was like, oh, wow, there's a bunch of mammals here. And this was a pretty big paper. I believe it was in Science. There was like a whole like documentary that came out with it as well. Another thing I am trying really hard to do in my science writing is to kind of be a little funny. I think putting a little bit of humor in your writing is great. And I know Joe's great at this. He's definitely a funny guy. So if I could get a researcher saying something kind of funny, I'm quoting them on that because I love it. So in this case, it was a story about a 300,000-year-old stick, right? What I like to do is I like to take a step back and realize that some of the people reading my stories don't really care. They're like, well, okay, so what? So what? There's a question I always ask my sources is, there's a lot going on in the world right now. And I literally say it like this every time. I say, there's a lot going on in the world right now between, politics, pandemic, protest, all of this. A reader might happen upon my story and they might see this and they might say, you know what, I'll give it, a couple seconds, maybe a few minutes of my time. Like, why is this important to you? And I use that frame to always ask the question, why is this important? And they'll give it to me. In this particular case, the guy said to me, it's a stick, sure. And he admitted, it's just a stick. But he went on to say that, if you dismiss it as such, it's like calling, Neil Armstrong's footstep on the moon, just like, a footprint or something in the dirt. Like, it's like, you can't just dismiss this. And I just thought that was great. Now, another thing, looking at this, sometimes you can get so into your story that you forget to ask the most basic of questions. Or sometimes you're afraid to ask the most basic of questions. So you look at this stick and you think to yourself, how was that thrown? How was that stick used to hunt prey? Because that's what this whole story is about. And I realized the scientists, they weren't really telling me how the stick was being used. Not that they were hiding it, but it just seems so obvious, so apparent to them. Could you guys hold on for 1 second? I'm so sorry.
Joe's put a couple things in the chat under my name if you guys want to go in there and read about embargoes and Eureka alerts and such. It's in there. As Nicholas gets the mail or something.
Hi, I don't know if you guys heard that. Apparently there is a gas leak in the house next to me and I actually have to evacuate.
Oh no.
I had a lot more to share here. If Beverly would like me to either share the rest of my PowerPoint or maybe hop on again sometime later, I'd be more than happy to, but
yeah, we'll figure it out. You go. We really appreciate you.
I'm so sorry, but just to quickly wrap it up while I have a couple moments, make sure the question that I always ask sources is, what surprised you the most? This is where I get my best quotes because it catches scientists off guard for a moment. They're thinking to myself, they're like, what did surprise me? And they start talking to you like a person as opposed to as like a prestigious scientist. The other thing I want to say is I just want to quickly run to this. The Open Notebook just put out a big kind of source sheet on all these different types of ways to find diverse sources. So make sure you're doing that. Check it out. They just posted this on their website. And last thing being, one thing I try to do in every one of my stories is quote graduate students, quote postdocs. Often they are doing most of the work. Sometimes it's the senior scientist who gets the most quotes, but you get the best quotes from the people who are actually doing the work. Sometimes it leads to really interesting extra findings. In this particular case, I found out that to find this particular butterfly wing, they had to use a human nostril hair in order to check this out. And I wouldn't have found that out if I hadn't spoken to the grad student. So just last plug being, speak to the grad students, make sure you're speaking to the grad students. Don't just quote the main researcher. But thank you guys so much. I am on Twitter. Please reach out to me. And I'm so sorry I have to cut this short, but thank you so much for your time. Send me emails and thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
Of course.
Be safe.
You guys take care.
Bye.
Bye. You don't think that was kind of convenient that he got called right in the middle?
All right.
Can I emphasize a few things, Burley?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, what you just heard was brilliant. All great lessons to keep in mind. The main thing that science grad students have a hard time doing is getting their head out of grad student mode and into storytelling mode. And what Nick was just saying is, a lot of the stuff is irrelevant to the science, but it's totally relevant to the storytelling. And you just have to get used to that. It's not an educational material that you're writing. You're writing a story for people to consume. And his point is, I don't always explain why something I'm doing is important to me. I sometimes just say, look, it's interesting. I don't know how important it is. I just thought it was interesting. But he's absolutely right. People have a lot of things that call for their attention. And you may have the most important story of all, but if it's not read, it's not that important, or it's not doing anybody any good. So keep that in mind. And it's the other kind of journalism is what we call spinach journalism. You should read this because it's good for you. And that doesn't go down well with editors or audiences in general. anyway, if anybody has questions about, we had questions about how you get access to embargoed material. I mean, one other thing about embargo is, just so you're careful about it, is a lot of people slap that term around like, well, you can just say it. And embargo is a two-way street. If you tell me something, I have to agree to your embargo, or it's free game as far as I'm concerned. So these journals, New England Journal and Science and Nature and what have you, they have journalists sign or e-sign an agreement that says, I won't talk about this. And it's a little tricky because they don't want to, they don't want to give it to everybody. At the same time, a lot of times when there's a paper in Science or Nature that has to do with a biotech company, you'll see a spike in the price before the paper comes out. So somebody's saying something to somebody, generally speaking, but the whole idea is they don't want this to get out to the public until the embargo lifts. Again, for good reason and bad, or good reason and not noble and not so noble reasons. But joining NASW, the National Association of Science Writers, used to be enough to get you access to the embargoed section of Eureka Alert. And I mean, I guess I'm promoting NASW as a place that you might consider joining, just if you really want to go down this route. And there's a special rate for students. Anyway, I think that was the 2 points I wanted to make. But just that what Nick said was, was spot on, and really we're lucky to. He's a great guy. I mean, as he said, we worked together for a while, and what he said was spot on. So I'm done.
So I think that now Eureka Alert requires you to submit 2 to 3 articles that have been published in the last 6 months, but it's online if you want to look at how you can join and if you're eligible. What I might ask Nicholas to do is do like a video, like a self video of himself answering some of the questions that are left in the chat. And I bet he will be happy to share the PowerPoint. And if he is, I'll pop that in the Slack channel with this video in the next week or something. So sorry, that was cut short, but as excuses go, I think it was a good one. Thanks everybody for showing up, and I'll see you next Mentor Chat. Bye.
Thank you.